Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Summarize Augustus' City of Marble by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now, this is another of OSP's fantastic Roman history videos. We've done a couple of them in the past, and I have always enjoyed them very much. So I'm excited to get into this one. Now, if you guys enjoy this reaction, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description down below, and will give you access to exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
Of all the things Augustus did, his most widely celebrated accomplishment was having found Rome as a city of bricks and leaving it as a city of marble.
Yes, and this is a direct reference to a quote that was attributed to Augustus by Suetonius. Apparently, Augustus said, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." Now, did he actually say that? Maybe. We don't really know. Probably not. Is that true? Did Augustus find Rome a city of bricks and leave it a city of marble? Well, not exactly. I think that suggests a bigger change than actually did happen, but did Augustus have a rather ambitious architectural program? Did he build a lot of these impressive marble structures? Yes, absolutely. And as they're suggesting here, it was a big part of his legacy and remains a big part, though I'm not sure if it is the biggest part as they say, but it remains a real big part of how we remember Augustus.
After the historian Suetonius put that quote in the first emperor's mouth, nothing else in his impressive and winding career emblazoned itself so thoroughly into the popular historical conscience. Not avenging his great uncle's assassination, not winning Rome's last-ish civil war, not even conquering Egypt from the formidable Cleopatra, and it also wasn't transforming the Roman Republic into an empire or founding a royal dynasty despite their massive long-term implications.
I would say that Augustus is best remembered for the Pax Romana, this era of prosperity, culture, and peace that descended upon Rome after he took control, and part of that are his impressive building programs. So I'm not necessarily sure that that individually defines his legacy as much as OSP is suggesting, but I do think they're making an apt point. This is a very important and big part of his legacy.
Augustus himself would like us to remember him for restoring the Republic and bringing peace to the Mediterranean, as he made a very big deal about those two, but those may well have been the groundwork for his lasting and most tangible achievement of giving Rome its identity. Now, it's not as if the Roman people didn't have a distinct character to them already. The previous 5 centuries had shown them to be calculating, devoted, opulent, fiercely pragmatic, more fiercely militaristic, and mayhaps a tad narcissistic, but these traits were understood conceptually through old fables of great Romans demonstrating virtue in the face of peril. These ideas of Romanness or Romanitas had yet to take real physical form.
Yeah, and I think they're making a good point here. I think Augustus really put an emphasis on those Roman virtues and traditions, and he brought Rome, as in the culture, and Rome, the city itself, to a point it had never been before. Now, of course, Rome was an important city before Augustus, absolutely. But with the reign of Augustus and the Pax Romana and this new flourishing of Roman culture and prosperity and wealth, Rome really became one of the most important, if not the most important centers of the Mediterranean world. Everything started to revolve around the Roman Empire and Rome, the city itself. So I really do believe that Augustus made this massive change in the Roman Empire and really made the city of Rome more important than it ever had been.
While Rome had its temples and one especially spiffy theater, Augustus saw an opportunity to make the city itself into a monument to Roman excellence. Now, there's a word for this, and that word is propaganda, but all his life, Augustus was really freaking good at it, and his building program was a natural extension of that weaselly talent.
Oh yeah, and this is absolutely true. You can look at any point throughout Augustus's life. Now, Augustus was a man with flaws, absolutely. He was not a perfect individual. He did bad things, he made mistakes, but something he was absolutely talented, skilled at, was politics, propaganda, presenting himself in a particular way. This is why he was able to basically establish the Roman Empire, establish this authoritarian form of government with himself at the top, while still keeping, mostly, the people and the senatorial class happy with the facade of Roman republicanism. Augustus was very talented at presenting an image.
But without a doubt, the centerpiece crowning his city of marble, his greatest accomplishment, was a strikingly humble building called the Ada Pacis Augustae, the Altar of Augustan Peace. To see why, let's do some history. So, if we consider the city as Augustus would have, namely, a canvas for imperial propaganda, we should appreciate just how blank it was in the 1st century BC. The city was situated among 7 hills on the east bank of the Tiber River. It was protected by the pre-Republican era Servian Wall, and the legal scope of the city was defined by a boundary called the Pomerium. Supposedly, the original course Romulus had plowed when founding his city. Everything inside the Pomerium was the true Rome, while everything outside the Pomerium was just stuff that belonged to Rome. But with trinkets like Athens, Ephesus, and Alexandria, Rome's belongings were rather more impressive than itself, because Rome in the Republican era was fully lacking in the big-ticket megaworks that later came to define it.
Yes, and this is the point I was making earlier. Rome was, certainly, an important city before Augustus, but in many ways it didn't measure up to some of its ancient rivals. We're talking about Athens, Alexandria, some of these real impressive ancient cities with a lot of wealth and culture. You know, Rome in many ways didn't measure up, but as I'm sure we're going to see in this video, Augustus really kicked off this process of making Rome this impressive and important city. Now, of course, it wasn't just under Augustus. It would continue long after the reign of Augustus, but the reason why Augustus is so important is that he really kicked off this process. And like I said, it's very closely associated with this idea of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This is associated with the flourishing of Roman culture and the flourishing of the city of Rome, begun under Augustus, continued beyond him.
No Colosseum, no Pantheon, no palaces, no massive baths, and only very recently had Caesar spent his dictatorial winnings on a major forum and upgrades to the Circus Maximus, which even still was an open racetrack with wooden bleachers. Pompey had earlier spent his campaign spoils on a new stone theater and meeting house for the Senate, and that was the single nicest building in Rome, which is cool, but when Alexandria had temples with vending machines that gave out holy water and the most magnificent library in the ancient world, it was time Rome stepped up its game.
Exactly. And so from that, we can see that it's not like Rome came up with this idea out of nowhere. They wanted to imitate some of these impressive structures of other ancient cities, and powerful men like Pompey and Caesar had begun some of these architectural projects to mainly make themselves seem impressive. I mean, look, there's always a couple of ways to frame these massive building projects. A lot of them are a genuine benefit to the Roman people, but usually the intention is to boost the reputation of whoever is funding these building projects. But whatever the case, we can see there was already a bit of a move towards this before Augustus, but Augustus, with his power and his position and the wealth of the empire in a time of peace, you know, he was well situated to do exactly what he did, to really kick off these building projects that would be continued and imitated by many, many emperors who came after him.
So, what to build and where? Well, first things first, libraries. Augustus built a library for Greek and Roman literature in a new temple to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, and another one in the portico of his sister Octavia just outside the Pomerium. At the same time, he built another structure further outside the Pomerium, an ornate mausoleum for him and his family that signified his commitment to Rome by his intent to die there. It's a grand tholos-shaped tomb covered with trees, and it was also a giant middle finger to his rival Marcus Antonius, who allegedly wished to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. Scandal. Now, one bit of land between the hills...
Oh yeah, that was a big scandal when you have the conflict between Augustus, or as we would call him at the time, Octavian, and Mark Antony. One of Octavian's little tricks was to present Mark Antony as someone who had turned his back on Rome and had been seduced by Cleopatra, the Eastern ways. You know, he's more Egyptian than he was Roman. This was one of the propaganda pieces that Octavian used. And so in contrast, Octavian, or Augustus, as he would be known as emperor, is trying to portray himself as, fully Roman. I'm gonna live and die in this city. That is my identity. Like we're saying, a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of these building projects are associated with Augustus trying to build his image. And we can see this in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different policy. For example, Augustus was a big supporter of the arts. Part of that was paying a lot of writers to pen very favorable histories about Augustus. So you say, yes, I'm funding the arts, I'm funding all these historians, but of course when they write their histories, they're going to write favorably about me. So you can see how it all sort of links up.
The Tiber River had some special significance due to both geography and complex ancient legalese. See, one of the Pomerium's quirks is that armies were forbidden to cross it and enter the city. History informs us that they did, with distressingly high frequency, but the point is they weren't supposed to.
Yeah, well, the idea of the Pomerium, it's this sort of sacred boundary around the city of Rome, and you're not supposed to bring your armed men inside that boundary so we can have peaceful republican politics. That didn't work, especially in the late Republic. Men like Pompey and Caesar and all of these politicians of the late Republican era leading around armed gangs, attacking each other. The Pomerium, frankly, had lost a lot of its value at this point. I'm sure to a lot of people it must have seemed a little silly because no one was obeying the rules, but one of the things Augustus did was sort of reinforce some of these old Roman traditions and virtues, even though what he was actually doing was directly opposed to many of the old Republican ways. He didn't want you to know that.
So, in the Republican period, the military needed an easily accessible place to train and drill, and they dedicated this handy floodplain by the river to their god of war and made it into the Field of Mars, or Campus Martius. Various generals over the centuries had built a handful of temples with the spoils of successful campaigns, but by the time of Augustus, it was still pretty sparse, so it would make the perfect place to commemorate his victories. Not just because it was free real estate, but also great symbolism. Mars was the father of the twins Romulus and Remus, and by extension, the ancestor of Rome. Augustus, meanwhile, traced his ancestry up to the hero Aeneas and his mother Venus, who was notably a consort of Mars. So this pairing of Mars and Venus is echoed down the generations by the match of their descendants, Rome and Augustus. Mythologically, this is fun and cool, but the practical outcome was our favorite princeps making himself inextricable from the very concept of Rome.
Yep. I mean, this is the whole, I am the Senate type deal. Augustus is saying, this is my identity. I am Rome. I represent this culture. And if we want to talk about the gods or anything sort of divine, it was mentioned on the screen earlier in the video, Augustus, the divine adopted son of the divine, or at least posthumously divine, Julius Caesar. So a lot of this identity, a lot of this sort of building an image for yourself as emperor, or, not explicitly emperor, but princeps, is about intertwining yourself, your legacy, and your identity with Roman culture and Roman religion, the gods themselves. This is how you make yourself more than a man, even if you just claim to be one amongst many.
It meant restoring dozens of temples and finishing political buildings like the Septa Iulia, a vote-counting hall first commissioned by Caesar, so that way, even when he made a big show of restoring the institutions of the Republic, the very machinery of government was associated with the patronage of Augustus.
Yep.
Clever.
Bastard. Very clever. Very clever. And they're laying it out exactly the same way I did. Augustus is, in reality, reshaping the government around his patronage. He is reinforcing his authoritarian position at the top of the Roman government. But in public, he is presenting this image as if he is restoring the Republic. I'm restoring the institutions, the virtues, the ways of the Roman Republic, which have been lost for so long. And people like that. People like that a lot. But that's not actually what he is doing. Now, the thing is, a lot of those emperors that came after Augustus were not nearly as talented as him at pretending like they were actually Republicans. But they were certainly as authoritarian. So as we go down the line, we get later and later into Roman history, we get a lot of very authoritarian Roman emperors who just drop the pretense of being princeps, being republican in any sort of manner, And that relationship between the emperor and religion, the gods, becomes even closer over time as well. Augustus had a lot of tact. He was a smart guy.
But clever. Another structure was more cosmic in scope, as Augustus put an Egyptian obelisk in the Campus Martius to work as a sundial meridian, casting a shadow on a marble grid to track the days of the years according to Caesar's Julian calendar. This Solarium Augusti not only celebrated the subjugation of Egypt by flaunting an obelisk, but it was dedicated 35 years after the calendar reform, conveying the message that the Julio-Augustan imperial family literally controls time. And that's not the only time he pulled this kind of nonsense. Back to the patronage thing, Augustus spent over a decade on a whole new forum, complete with a temple to Mars Ultor, the Avenger, in celebration of his victory against Caesar's assassins. This forum was not only another place where public business was conducted under the auspices of the princeps, but it had two statue galleries on either side, one of famous men from the Republican era, and one tracing the lineage of the Julian family back up to Aeneas.
And you can really see how all of this is reinforcing Augustus's position, celebrating his victory over the Egyptians, celebrating his victory against Caesar's assassins, celebrating the Julio-Claudian dynasty, celebrating his and Caesar's power over even time, the calendar that people used. It really bolstering his own power, his own image in a very obvious but also somewhat subtle type of way. I mean, it's obviously very clear what he's doing, but when you're just living in the city and you're surrounded by these monuments, these ideas will sort of start to seep into your worldview, whether you want them to or not.
Both of which culminated in Our Favorite Boy. And then he also built a new theater to honor his dead nephew Marcellus, but he specifically made it bigger than Pompey's theater. There's a whole dynastic angle to this, but frankly I just find this one petty, which, granted, is less obnoxious than proclaiming yourself the ruler of time. Luckily, he wasn't quite so pompous as to take all the credit, and was happy to let his badass right-hand man Marcus Agrippa show off as well. Most famously, he made the first draft of the as-of-yet tragically domeless Pantheon, but he also built the first major public baths in the city of Rome, supplied by water from his new Aqua Virgo, one of two aqueducts overseen by Agrippa out of the three built during the reign of Augustus.
Yep, overseen by Agrippa. As mentioned, Agrippa was Augustus's right-hand man. Agrippa mainly handled the military side of things. He was absolutely masterful in that respect, but Agrippa was also a talented administrator, and he would oversee some of these infrastructure projects very skillfully.
The third of which was used to fill the Naumachia, an arena across the river that staged whole-ass naval battles.
Yep, this is sort of one of the famous little quirks from this era that people are often amazed by, and it really just shows you the amount of resources, wealth, manpower that Augustus had access to. I mean, truly, truly remarkable.
Romans are among the rare few who could make something so basic as water into something so immensely hardcore. So with all that built, we come to 13 BC, when Augustus returned from campaigns in the west and the Senate voted to build an altar of Augustan peace on the Campus Martius, finished and consecrated a few years later in 9 BC. Unlike, say, the Temple of Mars Ultor, this wasn't a temple, it's a sacrificial altar. It's raised on a podium with one staircase leading in and walls on all four sides, but there's no roof. Roman state religion was a public affair and many sacrifices were done outdoors. But since this was part of the Augustan program, it was another vehicle for, of course, propaganda. And even by the standards of what he did so far, the Autopakis was thick with symbolism, much of it self-serving. The inside walls are decorated with bountiful fruit garlands and ox skulls in the traditional style, and the bottom of the outside walls have ornate floral patterns of acanthus leaves and some 50 other species of plants and animals. As with all classical sculpture work, it would have been painted, so every leaf, vine, and fig...
And by the way, this is something very important to note, and something which I think a lot of people don't realize. Now, if you're a bit of a Roman history buff, you probably know this, but people are often surprised to learn that a lot of these marble structures, temples, buildings, monuments, were actually painted in very bright colors. We look at the remains, what we have left, or whatever we see in museums. We look at these stark white marble structures, and that gives us a particular idea of sort of the Roman psyche. But to really transport yourself back to the time period, you have to remember that a lot of these buildings would have been very colorful, painted in bright colors that may seem a bit garish to us, maybe a little too vivacious, but That's how the Romans did it. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about Augustus's city of marble. It was not this, bright white city. It was a very colorful place.
Here were brightly colored and gilded to really sell the natural beauty and the idea of a new golden age that Augustus had created for Rome. Looking upwards now toward the business portion of the frieze, we find a selection of 4 panels depicting mythological scenes. The figures are a smidge dubious to identify, as some panels are quite thoroughly trashed, but we can make some educated guesses. On the front left of the altar is the scene of baby Romulus and Remus with their wolf mom and probably Mars looking over them, while on the right side is a scene of sacrifices made by probably Rome's second king Numa Pompilius, who has strong associations with peace and piety. But people used to say he's Aeneas, so The back right panel has the goddess Roma armored up and sitting on a pile of either her own weapons or one she confiscated, unclear. And finally, there's the real splash panel of anyone from Pax to Roma again to Mother Earth to baby Venus Genetrix holding 2 children that likely symbolize the people of Rome, surrounded by the bounty of the lands on one side and the sea on the other. Exact figures notwithstanding, the combined effect is pretty clear. Front panels show, here's where we came from, and the back panels say, look at us, we did it, Golden Age ahoy! And lastly, the long ends of the altar have paired processional friezes, possibly in reference to the ones on the Parthenon, but here depicting a religious procession from around 13 BC when the altar was commissioned. One side shows politicians and the senatorial elite, while the other shows the extended imperial family as a representation of the Senate and people of Rome.
Right. And so with this particular monument, we can see all the messages that are being communicated, right? We can see, first off, this communication of this golden age of Roman culture that we are now in. We can see this association between Augustus, his family, and this Roman way, this Roman culture, also this close intertwining with the gods and religion of Rome. Just all these very interesting associations that, in some ways seem very clear, but once again, the emperors who came after Augustus would really cement some of these associations, particularly themselves as emperor, with some sort of god or being divine. They would be a lot more clear about it than Augustus would. You could say maybe a lot less tactful, but we can see a lot of these messages being communicated in these monuments and buildings constructed on the orders of Augustus.
Except here, the people is Augustus's people, rendered so specifically that we can actually pick out individuals like the princeps and his wife Livia, Agrippa and Julia, and even some royal kiddos. One kid is shown being visibly bored and pulling on Agrippa's toga so he can see better, which is pretty adorable.
That's
especially
funny.
By the standards of, again, vigorous propaganda. The intermingled
Yeah, always worth remembering. This is all propaganda, but that's a cute little detail. I'm surprised, I am kind of surprised they included something as sort of down-to-earth as that. That's pretty endearing, I think. But yes, this is all imperial propaganda, Augustan propaganda, in one way or another.
Imagery of deities and royals, celebrations of a plentiful golden age, and the triumph of peace are all supporting Augustan political power and pushing this concept of the princeps as a divine patron of Rome's success. And by putting all this on the field of Mars, it creates a causal chain between Roman power, the Pax Romana, and natural prosperity, of which our boy the Time King guarantees all 3. The design of the Areopagus is so elegant and the sculpture work is absolutely exquisite. It's in no small part because of powerful iconography like this that Romans were willing to put up with monarchs again, because the results spoke for themselves and it all just seemed to fit.
Yeah, well, look, put yourself in the mindset of a Roman living around this time period. Now look, Romans for a long, long time had been fiercely Republican. They absolutely hated the idea of monarchy, of kingship, and very consciously, Augustus did not identify himself with monarchy. And even Julius Caesar, though he came close at times, made sure to at least try and steer clear of the idea of monarchy. But, and in many ways this is monarchy in a different name, you think about the recent experiences of Roman people, there had been chaos and political violence in the Republic for decades, 100 years at this point, especially in the last couple of decades, couple of years with the civil wars between Caesar and Pompey, the conspirators, with Augustus and Mark Antony, there had been this intense violence for years and years and years. All people wanted was peace, prosperity, stability. And so we get to the sole rule of Augustus, and like I said, he's very talented at all of this. He's able to present this facade of republicanism, and it is a facade, it's absolutely false, while putting himself in absolute power. But you know what? That absolute power comes with the Pax Romana, with peace, prosperity, flourishing of culture and art and literature, a better life for many, many people, or at least a lack of violence compared to previous years. And so, alongside a lot of this impressive propaganda, like I said, in one way, very clear propaganda, but on the other hand, it's so permissive. It's everywhere. It's kind of difficult not to absorb some of this if you're living your life amongst these buildings and monuments. They would really impart upon you the power of Augustus. You can sort of understand why people would accept this, with the propaganda, the image that Augustus puts forth, the peace and prosperity. It all begins to sort of fall into place despite this Roman hatred of kingship and monarchy. Augustus really managed to do it, and this is why he is a very, very skilled politician.
Perhaps the symbolism is too powerful, as the Areopagus was the focal point of the most consequential moment of classical reception in the 1900s, fascism. After fragments had been...
And look, if you're going to bring that up, absolutely true. A lot of these fascists, including the Nazis, but of course particularly Mussolini and the Italian fascists, would look back on these Roman way of doing things, Roman authority, Roman power, and they would cherish those images. I mean, the word fascism comes from the fasces, this Roman symbol of power and authority. And so, a lot of these 20th century fascists looked back on Roman power and authority, and they sought to emulate it in one way or another, of course, leading to these absolutely horrible, violent results. But there is a link there.
Re-identified in 1903, the altar was reconstructed adjacent to the mausoleum in 1938 by Benito Mussolini, as part of his propaganda campaign tying himself to Augustus on the 2000th anniversary of his birth.
This is one of the things that Mussolini claimed to do. He wanted to reforge the Roman Empire. Like I said, this is something that Mussolini would point back to a lot. And even other fascists, someone like Hitler, they would also touch back on and look back on this sort of Roman base of power. But of course, it was especially effective in an Italian context.
This helped proclaim the glory of the new Roman Empire and justified all the totalitarianism. But whatever subtlety was possessed by the divine son of the deified Julius Caesar, the Lord of Time, Imperator Kaiser Augustus, that subtlety was fully lacking in Il Duce Mussolini. So the already fiercely propagandistic iconography of Augustan Rome was flipped on turbo and used by Italian and German fascists as an excuse for, atrocities.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, and I think he's absolutely right that a lot of this propaganda, which, man, this propaganda was already real pervasive and clear under the Romans. Under the totalitarianism of the 20th century, you can use the Italian fascists under Mussolini as an example. They ramped it up to 100. This propaganda was, even more intense, and of course used to justify these horrible, horrible atrocities.
So it's rather important that historians and audiences alike be careful not to blindly glorify any civilization. We should celebrate the nice and criticize the yikes, because neither exists in a vacuum.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is what we need to stay cognizant of when we look back on someone like Augustus. I describe how skillful he was at constructing this image, very skillful politician. But hey, remember, just being, that is not inherently good. There were a lot of negatives about the authoritarian rule of Augustus. I certainly don't support any style of authoritarian government, right? So you need to look at these things in context, you need to understand them, and you need to understand where they can be reapplied, right? Just being good at something does not make it inherently good. You can be skillful at propaganda, skillful at construction, any of these types of things that we've talked about in this video, and use them for absolutely intolerable, horrible results.
Augustus was endlessly clever. He was also a lying, weaselly rascal, and I fucking hate him. The Areopagus is spectacular. Augustan Rome is magnificent. But what did it cost the Romans, and what would it later cost Europe? Thank you for watching.
Yeah.
I had originally...
And I don't know if you could say, Augustan Rome, but later, I wouldn't draw causality, right? But yeah, I think it's absolutely worth thinking about that. And it basically made the point I was making. Augustus was clever, skillful, wily, but he was very brutal at times. And, look at his effect on the Republican institutions of Rome. Not good at all. If you're a supporter of republicanism or that sort of thing, then Augustus was not a good guy, even though Rome under him was magnificent and prosperous. I think that they framed it in a correct way. We got to look at these things fairly. We got to look at them contextually. We got to interpret them. We got to look at, there's good stuff, there's bad stuff. Be careful how we interpret these things. Be careful what we bring to the present. Don't just mindlessly worship things from the past because you like them. Yeah, very interesting video. A bit more of a morose, serious ending, but I think a very fascinating topic. We basically looked at what I thought we were going to look at, though they took it a little more broadly than I thought they would. Found Rome a city of bricks, left it a city of marble. We didn't really discuss the veracity of that comment. Now, I mentioned earlier, did Augustus actually say it? We don't know. Probably not, would be my guess. But did he actually do that? And I know we just spent this entire video talking about all of these great marble structures that he built, but if you actually look at the sort of transition from Rome being a city of bricks to a city of marble, the change was certainly much longer and slower than just the years under Augustus. No, Augustus did not take the city of Rome, and when he was gone, everything was marble. Absolutely not. He built a lot of prominent marble structures, but the change was maybe not as dramatic as that quote may suggest. But the change continued long after Augustus was gone. And that's what I was trying to point out earlier in this video. The whole Pax Romana, all of these infrastructure projects, these are things that Augustus started and made a lot of progress on. But they would continue after he was gone because of what he did. He was incredibly, incredibly influential. Anyway, real interesting topic. I always enjoy these OSP videos. I think they do a really good job with this sort of stuff. I'm excited to do more Roman history from them. If you have any other reactions you would like me to do, particularly any other OSP reactions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, all that good stuff. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.